Hey folks, I hope you're doing really well. Today, I'd like to talk about another feature in Dawn of War that I think was actually probably the best design innovation type thing that we did, and that's control points. If you're not familiar, Dawn of War is a real-time strategy game. It's based in the Warhammer 40k universe, and it added squads. We had, control points. We had multiplayer, 4 different races, big single-player campaign. And when I think about all those features, control points stand out to me so much as the thing that we sort of innovated the most on for a few different reasons. First and foremost, if you look at the other RTS games that are sort of in the space that are pretty typical, the traditional method for generating resources was to have resource nodes, like a mineral, that was near your base, and then you would have some sort of peon unit run back and forth and collect those units. Those resources. Those minerals could then be scattered across the map, and you could expand and collect more of them. What the side of like that created like a nice sense of generating resources local to your bases, and it put tension around where to place bases. It kind of forced the player's hand. They could, what didn't make sense just to place a base anywhere. But what it did is that resource channel became the weakest link in an army. What that results in is enemy players wanting to focus their attacks on destroying that resource chain. If an enemy could attack and destroy your peons, that could completely decimate the game. And that could just make you quit at that point. Because the amount of time that it took to rebuild those peons in order to reestablish that income of resources by having them collect those minerals could just be so overwhelming that it would skew the results so far in the opponent's favor. This then, of course, means the most effective way to win would be to attack another enemy's line of peons. Now, when you think about it from a fantasy perspective, it's kind of weird, right? Like, imagine a space marine walking into an enemy's base, and rather than, like, say, orcs, and rather than attacking the biggest, most obvious threat, which is another orc or like a dreadnought or something, they ignore all of that and they run to the grots that are collecting resources, and they attack and kill those. So from a fantasy perspective, it never made sense. But also from a gameplay perspective, it felt like having to focus on the enemy's peon line, it just didn't feel like it was that interesting. Like, you're building these big armies in order to fight each other, but then the best path to success is to make those armies completely avoid each other and go for the resource line of peons. It doesn't really seem like it's the most fun way to approach the problem of how do you defeat the enemy. And, players are going to do what is the most efficient thing. If the most efficient thing is to kill the peons, no matter how cool it is to have those enemies fight each other or those armies fight each other, they're going to attack that peon line. So instead, first, like, we didn't want to have peon lines. It just would be like, yes, we could use servitors, but even it didn't really like fit the fantasy very well with Warhammer across the board with all the different armies. And I suppose that we could have had different ways of collecting resources per an army faction. But it wasn't the right direction for us to take. Having servitors collect resources just didn't make sense. On top of that, we saw the problem that was evident with the resource line of peons back and forth. It also meant that the more efficient fight was around the enemy's base. Whereas we wanted it to feel like the more efficient fight should be like the place where most battles happen should be out at the front lines, like out on the battlefield, as opposed to in your base. The in your base should feel like That's the last line of defense. That's the final straw. That's where if the enemy is in there, you're on your last legs. I think MOBAs do this really well, right? Like if your enemy, if one team, sorry, is in the enemy base, then that's pretty close to game over. So we wanted there to be a much more of a clear kind of battle line at the front. So control points, or the command points or control points, whatever they ended up being called, it's been a long time. What they did is it allowed us to put them out in the middle, and then players could capture them, and then players would focus their fight over them. Because resources turn into army, which turn into battle, and resource generation is the kind of foundation for all of the gameplay that is unlocked when you're playing a real-time strategy game. Resource generation and management is one of the core elements of the game that, as a player, you have to be able to like get really good at in order to play the game well. So by putting the dominant resource at the control points, which could then get fought over by the enemies and allow them to be captured by units that were in that front line and meant to be there and meant to be fighting there, it allowed us to kind of focus the players to say, hey, no, you should be fighting over the front line as opposed to fighting over these peons in each other's bases. It created all kinds of balance issues. I remember there was an early test when we had a 3-lane map, and it was 6v6, and the battle just went on forever because the amount of resources being generated by each of the points, there was probably too many points. I think that there was at least 3 points per lane. So then, you know, each team could secure 2, and then the battle over the center one was the one that kept on flipping back and forth. And from a balance perspective, that allowed each of the teams to just have too much resources so they could continually supply their front lines. I think that was also when probably respawning of squads was a bit too fast, but so it did create balance problems. But when you think about it, I think it fits better with the fantasy. I mean, Company Heroes still uses it to this day. I'm surprised that more real-time strategy games don't employ the same method for generating resources, veering away from the traditional line of peons, which, let's be real, it just doesn't feel cool. You know, like having your units, your Space Marines or your infantry or whatever, try and avoid each other in order to get to the peon line. It doesn't feel, it's not that cool. And sometimes designing something can just be about being cool, right? It can just be about something that is like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It is something that as a player, you're going to feel good about fundamentally. And it's something that you can put in front of the player and say, hey, this is like a cool activity. Do this, play over this, fight over this control point. Don't fight over some weird peon line. So yeah, I think that the control points or command points, by adding those, by making that change, I actually think that's probably the biggest, most impactful thing the Dawn of War did for real-time strategy games. I hope you found this useful or valuable or interesting or whatever. If you like this, hit like. It's going to help the algorithm do its weird random thing, whatever it does. Yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.